process and to help you get to a place where you are. But that also allows us and companies similarly situated to continue to provide the products that schools around the country, around your great state, are increasingly want, like, and use.
I'm sorry, Representative Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sort of a general question. I hope I'm not retreading too much here, but so if a student has an account in the Google education system, we'll call it, through the user agreement or whatever, do you guys have access to whatever the student's putting in those emails?
Mr. Barnes.
What do you mean by access?
So,
Representative Everett.
thank you, Mr. Chair. So let's say they're in the Google system, so they're using the email for the Google system to be collaborative for whatever reason. So does Google itself have the right to go into these emails and actually read what the students are transmitting back and forth when they're in that Google education system?
Mr. Barnes.
But under certain circumstances, we would, if served a warrant, if there was some sort of judicial process. But as a matter of having people sort of joyride through people's accounts, no.
Representative Everett.
Sure, so you're not aggregating data that you might be able to glean off of student accounts while they're in the education system.
Mr. Barnes.
We're not aggregating data. I don't think I understand the
Representative Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I mean, if it's in the Google system, and obviously Google's a search engine, it does a lot of things. So you have a lot of data that's going back and forth. You know, Google also sort of, well publicized that it does collect data, on its private users as well, or, in the public school environment. You guys aggregate data based on what you collected.
Right. So this goes to the response that I gave to Representative Garnett a few minutes ago. It seems to me, I used fortuitously the example of amassing a profile. And I believe that's what, if I'm understanding your question correctly, do we create a profile of students that is then used in an outside the school environment way? And the answer is that no.
Representative Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So how do you use it inside the school way? I mean, what do you do with that data? How do you aggregate it? And then do you use that for marketing outside?
Mr. Barnes.
But to the latter part, no, we don't. I mean, that's not cross-pollinated. How do we use it inside? And this is the real challenge here, because I can't do a quick count here. We'll call it a dozen or so folks sitting around the table here. If I were to ask each of you individually right now to give me a definition of what you think data means, or what you think student data means, if I was to ask the audience members, I dare say we would probably not come to a common understanding of that, because for some context, student data are the papers that we talked with Representative Lundeen about. It's the content of email. There's some student data which isn't specific to the student, but as any user of a Google service, we run analytics all the time to understand how do people use our service. Do they commonly misspell a word that needs to go into the dictionary? Is the uptime appropriate? Are the appropriate amount of resources internally devoted to providing the service? At what times of day? I mean, there's a lot of sort of back-end, you call it anonymized, if you will, data that is used just in the provision of the service. The Google Apps for Education platform is one that's shared by a lot of students and a lot of schools across the country, and it's not individualized in a way, so that we can use and understand how our services are used. So that does generate some data, but that data isn't specific to any one individual. We don't use, as I said a minute ago, we don't use the student data to market to them, though. What's inside that bounded universe, when you log into your Google Apps for Education account, that's not used for marketing, nor do they receive it.
Mr. Chair, this should be my final question.
Thank you.
So if you are mining data, then obviously you're collecting data on students. Shouldn't you have that transparency to explain exactly what you're collecting and how you're using that data, and shouldn't you have that transparency so parents and students should know that?
Mr. Barnes.
Well, I don't know what mining data means in that context. I mean, again, it's a term that I think is, folks might have some notion of what they mean by that, but I don't understand here what you mean by if you're mining that data, or even if that data, if how we understand whether people spell the word ostentatious incorrectly on a frequent basis is useful to anyone. But nor do I know if that could even be pulled out. I mean, this is part of the general use of the system that sort of feeds into the understanding of how the service is provided and how the service is used. But it's not Johnny did this and Johnny spelled ostentatious wrong, and it's not pegged on an individual basis where you can go back and sort of assemble a host of misspellings from a student or from anyone for that matter.
Representative Barnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think one of the things we talked about a little bit more when, a little bit earlier when Mr. Moore was testifying was really making sure that we were protecting students, especially through these click-through types of apps. So I guess one question I have is regarding sort of the Google Apps for Education. I want to make sure that we're protecting our students so that when they do click through, that they're not signing away some authority to read and scan those emails, because I know in other states there have been some issues that have been brought up regarding that. And so I guess just to the, that's one thing that I'll make sure that as we go forward and we're reviewing everything, that the click-through applies to protecting students, even when it comes to the Google Apps for Education.
Mr. Barnes.
So, thank you, Representative Barnett, for giving me the chance to explain two things to you here. So,
I'm going to do this quickly.
yes, sir. So last year we made a significant change in the way that the email, well, let me stop and first say that students don't agree to Google Apps for Education. The school system does. The system is the one that decides they want to use Google Apps for Education. There is an administrator who is responsible for provisioning those services at the appropriate level determined solely by the district. So some students may have access to some services. Teachers, administrators may have access to all services. That can be controlled by the school district administrator. And that is, so it's not one size fits all, everybody gets everything. That's determined by the individual schools. Last year, we made a significant change in the way that one of the components of that, the email portion, was provided. Prior to that, it had been similar to the way that the consumer email was used. It went through the same sort of process that the consumer email was used, but no advertising was ever served. The administrators had the option to turn on advertising if they wanted to. That was an early feature. Very few did. So last year, we totally removed the capability to serve any ads in the email aspect of Google Apps for Education. So for any students who have that, nobody could even turn that on now if they don't want to. As I mentioned earlier, search has ads turned off in it by default in Google Apps for Education too. So the issue that you alluded to in other states, that is something that just the foundation for that doesn't even exist anymore.
Representative Lundin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Promise.